It is not clear what stage this orthodox civilization is in, but it clearly is not in its stage of decay. It would appear that orthodox civilization began as a period of mixture 5001-300, and is now in its second period of expansion. The first period of expansion, covering 1500 to 1900, had just begun to change into an age of conflict, 1900 to 1920, when the vested interests of the society were wiped away by the defeat at the hands of Germany in 1917 and replaced by a new organization of society which gave rise to a second age of expansion, since 1921. During much of the last 400 years culminating in the 20th century, the fringes of Asia have been occupied by a semicircle of old dying civilizations, Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, Japanese. These have been under pressure from Western civilization coming in from the oceans and from Orthodox civilization pushing outward from the heart of the Eurasian land mass. The oceanic pressure began with Vasco da Gama in India in 1498, culminated aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay in 1945, and still continued with the Anglo-French attack on Suez in 1956. The Russian pressure from the continental heartland was applied to the inner frontiers of China, Iran, and Turkey from the 17th century to the present. Much of the world's history in the 20th century has arisen from the interactions of these three factors: the continental heartland of Russian power, the shattered cultures of the buffer fringe of Asia, and the oceanic powers of Western civilization. Chapter 2: Cultural Diffusion in Western Civilization. We have said that the culture of a civilization is created in its core area originally and moves outward into peripheral areas which thus become part of the civilization. This movement of cultural elements is called diffusion by students of the subject. It is noteworthy that material elements of a culture, such as tools, weapons, vehicles, and such, diffuse more readily and thus more rapidly than do the non-material elements such as ideas, art forms, religious outlook, or patterns of social behavior. For this reason the peripheral portions of a civilization, such as Assyria in Mesopotamian civilization, Rome or Spain in classical civilization, and the United States or Australia in Western civilization, tend to have a somewhat cruder and more material culture than the core area of the same civilization. Material elements of a culture also diffuse beyond the boundaries of a civilization into other societies, and do so much more readily than the non-material elements of the culture. For this reason the non-material and spiritual elements of a culture are what give it its distinctive character rather than its tools and weapons which can be so easily exported to entirely different societies. Thus, the distinctive character of Western civilization rests on its Christian heritage, its scientific outlook, its humanitarian elements, and its distinctive point of view in regard to the rights of the individual and respect for women rather than in such material things as firearms, tractors, plumbing fixtures, or skyscrapers, all of which are exportable commodities. The export of material elements in a culture, across its peripheral areas and beyond, to the peoples of totally different societies has strange results. As elements of material culture move from core to periphery inside a civilization, they tend, in the long run, to strengthen the periphery at the expense of the core because the core is more hampered in the use of material innovations by the strength of past vested interests and because the core devotes a much greater part of its wealth and energy to non-material culture. Thus, such aspects of the Industrial Revolution as automobiles and radios are European rather than American inventions, but have been developed and utilized to a far greater extent in America because this area was not hampered in their use by surviving elements of feudalism, of church domination, of rigid class distinctions, for example, in education, or by widespread attention to music, poetry, art, or religion such as we find in Europe. A similar contrast can be seen in classical civilization between Greek and Roman, or in Mesopotamian civilization between Sumerian and Assyrian, or in Mayan civilization between Mayan and Aztec. The diffusion of culture elements beyond the boundaries of one society into the culture of another society presents quite a different case. The boundaries between societies present relatively little hindrance to the diffusion of material elements, and relatively greater hindrance to the diffusion of non-material elements. Indeed, it is this fact which determines the boundary of the society, for, if the non-material elements also diffused, the new area into which they flowed would be a peripheral portion of the old society rather than a part of a quite different society. The diffusion of material elements from one society to another has a complex effect on the importing society. In the short run it is usually benefited by the importation, but in the long run it is frequently disorganized and weakened. When white men first came to North America, material elements from Western civilization spread rapidly among the different Indian tribes. The Plains Indians, for example, were weak and impoverished before 1543, but in that year the horse began to diffuse northward from the Spaniards in Mexico. Within a century the Plains Indians were raised to a much higher standard of living, because of ability to hunt buffalo from horseback, and were immensely strengthened in their ability to resist Americans coming westward across the continent. In the meantime, the Trans-Appalachian Indians, who had been very powerful in the 16th and early 17th centuries, began to receive firearms, steel traps, measles, and eventually whiskey from the French and later the English by way of the St. Lawrence. These greatly weakened the Woods Indians of the Trans-Appalachian area and ultimately weakened the Plains Indians of the Trans-Mississippi area, because measles and whiskey were devastating and demoralizing, and because the use of traps and guns by certain tribes made them dependent on whites for supplies at the same time that they allowed them to put great physical pressure on the more remote tribes which had not yet received guns or traps. Any united front of Reds against whites was impossible, and the Indians were disrupted, demoralized, and destroyed. In general, importation of an element of material culture from one society to another is helpful to the importing society in the long run only if it is, a, productive, b, can be made within the society itself, and, c, can be fitted into the non-material culture of the importing society without demoralizing it. The destructive impact of Western civilization upon so many other societies rests on its ability to demoralize their ideological and spiritual culture as much as its ability to destroy them in a material sense with firearms. When one society is destroyed by the impact of another society, the people are left in a debris of cultural elements derived from their own shattered culture as well as from the invading culture. These elements generally provide the instruments for fulfilling the material needs of these people, but they cannot be organized into a functioning society because of the lack of an ideology and spiritual cohesive. Such people either perish or are incorporated as individuals and small groups into some other culture, whose ideology they adopt for themselves and, above all, for their children. In some cases, however, the people left with the debris of a shattered culture are able to reintegrate the cultural elements into a new society and a new culture. They are able to do this because they obtain a new non-material culture and thus a new ideology and morale which serve as a cohesive for the scattered elements of past culture they have at hand. Such a new ideology may be imported or may be indigenous, but in either case it becomes sufficiently integrated with the necessary elements of material culture to form a functioning whole and thus a new society. It is by some such process as this that all new societies, and thus all new civilizations, have been born. In this way, classical civilization was born from the wreckage of Cretan civilization in the period 1150 B.C. 900 BC. And Western civilization was born from the wreckage of classical civilization in the period AD 350–700. It is possible that new civilizations may be born in the debris from the civilizations wrecked by Western civilization on the fringes of Asia. In this wreckage is debris from Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, and Japanese civilizations. Lieutenant would appear at the present time that new civilizations may be in the throes of birth in Japan, possibly in China, less likely in India, and dubiously in Turkey or Indonesia. The birth of a powerful civilization at any or several of these points would be of primary significance in world history, since it would serve as a counterbalance to the expansion of Soviet civilization on the landmass of Eurasia. Turning from a hypothetical future to a historical past, we can trace the diffusion of cultural elements within Western civilization from its core area across peripheral areas and outward to other societies. Some of these elements are sufficiently important to command a more detailed examination. Among the elements of the Western tradition which have diffused only very slowly or not at all are a closely related nexus of ideas at the basis of Western ideology. These include Christianity, the scientific outlook, humanitarianism, and the idea of the unique value and rights of the individual. But from this nexus of ideas have sprung a number of elements of material culture, of which the most noteworthy are associated with technology. These have diffused readily, even to other societies. This ability of Western technology to emigrate and the inability of the scientific outlook, with which such technology is fairly closely associated, to do so have created an anomalous situation. Societies such as Soviet Russia, which have, because of lack of the tradition of scientific method, shown little inventiveness in technology, are nevertheless able to threaten Western civilization by the use, on a gigantic scale, of a technology almost entirely imported from Western civilization. A similar situation may well develop in any new civilizations which come into existence on the fringes of Asia. The most important parts of Western technology can be listed under 4 headings. 1. Ability to kill, development of weapons. 2. Ability to preserve life, development of sanitation and medical services. 3. Ability to produce both food and industrial goods. 4. Improvements in transportation and communications. We have already spoken of the diffusion of Western firearms. The impact which these have had on peripheral areas and other societies, from Cortez's invasion of Mexico, in 1519 to the use of the first atom bomb on Japan in 1945, is obvious. Less obvious, but in the long run of much greater significance, is the ability of Western civilization to conquer disease and to postpone death. Sanitation and medical advances. These advances began in the core of Western civilization before 1500 but have exercised their full impact only since about 1750 with the advent of vaccination, the conquest of plague, and the steady advance in saving lives through the discovery of antisepsis in the 19th century and of the antibiotics in the 20th century. These discoveries and techniques have diffused outward from the core of Western civilization and have resulted in a fall in the death rate in Western Europe and America almost immediately, in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe somewhat later, and in Asia only in the period since 1900. The world-shaking significance of this diffusion will be discussed in a moment. Western civilization's conquest of the techniques of production are so outstanding that they have been honored by the term revolution in all history books concerned with the subject. The conquest of the problem of producing food, known as the agricultural revolution, began in England as long ago as the early 18th century, say about 1725. The conquest of the problem of producing manufactured goods, known as the Industrial Revolution, also began in England, about 50 years after the Agricultural Revolution, say about 1775. The relationship of these two revolutions to each other and to the revolution in sanitation and public health and the differing rates at which these three revolutions diffused is of the greatest importance for understanding both the history of Western civilization and its impact on other societies.